It was a quiet morning in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, but silence never means peace, Ibrahim. Traoré stood by the window staring at the sky. He wasn't watching the sunrise, he was waiting. What does a man see when he knows the world is watching him? What does he carry when the weight of an entire continent sits on his shoulders? And what do you do when the most powerful man on the internet posts something that threatens everything you're building? Marie rushed in, her footsteps echoed in the presidential hallway. Fast, anxious, she held a phone in her hand, screen glowing with headlines. Her voice shook. President Zuckerberg just posted. And sir, it's about us. Traoré didn't blink. He slowly turned around, and for a moment the silence returned, but this time it was heavy. Something big had just begun. Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward. He took Marie's phone, gently, brows furrowed, not in fear, but in focus. The screen was still open. Post was short, but its meaning explosive. Africa must embrace innovation, not rebellion. The algorithm cannot uplift instability. Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Meta. The comments under the post were worse flags, warnings, photos of soldiers, Western analysts debating Burkina Faso's future, videos of Traoré labeled unpredictable, radical, a threat to digital peace. Marie whispered. They're calling you dangerous, sir. But Traoré's eyes didn't flinch. He scrolled once, then stopped. A photo, his own face, edited to look like a dictator, captioned, "The African algorithm problem, #stop TRA or acute." Traoré turned off the phone, and in that moment, the entire palace felt like it was holding its breath. "Marie," he said softly, "do they think I need their app to raise my people?" She didn't answer because she already knew what came next. Traoré walked towards the war room, but there were no generals waiting, only a map of Africa and a folder marked Operation Dignity. Outside the palace, the city was waking up, but something had changed. The people weren't scrawling, they were listening, and something inside Traoré had already shifted, not out of rage, but out of purpose, because when a man is mocked by empires online, he doesn't fight with words, he builds something they cannot delete. That evening, the news cycle spun like a whirlwind. BBC, CNN, France 24, all flashing the same headline. Zuckerberg criticizes Burkina Faso's leader. Clips of Traoré's speeches were dissected by analysts. Old interviews re-uploaded. Some called him dangerous, others intrigued. But in Washington, D.C., something unexpected happened. A young journalist stood up during a press briefing and asked greater than President Obama once said, Africa needs strong institutions, not strong men. What does he think of Ibrahim Traoré? Pause, a shift in the room, then a screen lit up. Barack Obama, live from a global summit on digital governance. He adjusted his collar, looked into the camera, and said, greater than, I've read the headlines. I've seen the posts, but leadership isn't always about pleasing platforms. Sometimes it's about protecting people, and whether you agree with him or not, Ibrahim Traoré is standing for something. The crowd murmured, some clapped, others didn't know how to react. Obama continued, greater than Africa's voice is not a trend, it is not a filter, it is not a footnote in the West's narrative. Sometimes the most powerful protest is silence in the face of algorithms. The video went viral within hours. Hashtags #TRA or eAcute speaks, #Africa offline, #respect our leaders. In Ouagadougou, children gathered around radios, elders nodded slowly. A mural of Traoré went up near the university wall with one word beneath it, greater than. Unfiltered. And in Silicon Valley, Zuckerberg's team began quietly adjusting privacy filters in Burkina Faso, but it was too late. The world had already heard, and they weren't just listening, they were watching, because sometimes the man they call dangerous is just the one they fear. They can't control that night. No speeches, no tweets, no posts, just silence. Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in the presidential courtyard beneath the old baobab tree planted during Sankara's era, his jacket folded neatly beside him, a soft wind brushing the sand. Moonlight danced across his face, but his eyes were elsewhere, not on the headlines, not on Zuckerberg, not even on Obama's words, but on his people. He whispered to himself, greater than, was I too bold or just bold enough? Is silence a strength or a shield? Can a farmer's son change the algorithm of a continent? He looked at his hands, the same hands that once dug wells with his village, the same hands now signing decrees. Same hands Zuckerberg wanted to digitize. A faint sound echoed from the city. Fireworks. The youth were celebrating Obama's quote, but Traoré didn't smile, not yet. He stood up, brushed the dust from his trousers, looked toward the horizon, and in that moment, as the stars bore witness, President of Burkina Faso made a vow not to fight the West, not to curse the tech giants, but to remain something far more dangerous to them, greater than unbought, unbroken, unfiltered. He walked back inside without saying a word, but his silence roared louder than any post Zuckerberg ever wrote. The next morning the world held its breath. Cameras flashed, reporters crowded the press hall, social media buzzed like a beehive, but no one knew what Ibrahim Traoré would say, and then silence until the golden doors of the presidential palace creaked open. Traoré stepped forward, dark blue suit, no tie, eyes, calm posture. Steady. Marie, his assistant, stood behind him. Quiet, watchful, he faced the world. Africa has been watched for centuries. He paused. We were studied, measured, judged. Corrected. Now we will be understood. A stir moved through the audience. Mr. Zuckerberg, he said calmly, we saw your post, we felt your lens, we understand your algorithm. He held up a photo, the very one Zuckerberg had shared, a young Burkina girl holding a tablet, her smile radiant. The caption beneath it read, Africa is rising, and we're here to help. But help, he said, is not ownership. We don't rise because Silicon Valley noticed us. We rise because our roots are deep. Applause broke out, but he raised his hand. Silence returned. Africa does not need to be saved. It must be respected. He looked directly into the camera, eyes sharp, voice slow. Mr. Zuckerberg, if you truly wish to help us, then listen. Don't post us, partner with us. Don't program our future, empower our present. Then came the announcement, a new initiative, Project Sankofaneta, Pan-African Data Sovereignty Movement, locally stored servers, tech training in every village, youth-led content platforms funded not by the West, but by regional unions and diaspora coalitions. Let our data tell our stories, Traoré declared. Let our children code their own futures. Behind him, a screen lit up. Hashtag Respect Africa, #SANKOF, and net hash. Our voices, our code, thunderous. Applause. Some stood, some wept. Obama watched from Washington. Zuckerberg from Menlo Park and the continent. It roared in a small village near Gawa. A woman named Fatou watched the speech on her neighbor's TV. She had no formal education, no electricity in her home, but that night she felt something shift. Fatou had been working for years to rebuild her community's broken well, with local stone, with scraped metal, with her own hands too. Days after the press conference, she received a Kala. New solar-powered pump was being installed, funded by Project Sankofaneta, run by her own son, trained through one of the new tech centers. She cried. For the first time, she said, we're not begging, we're building. And across the country, in a dusty schoolyard in Kaya, a boy named Mamadou ran toward his teacher with a handmade gift, a drawing of Traoré holding a giant book with the words, Our Story, across the cover. He gave it to a passing government repay. A week later, the image was printed across billboards in Ouagadougou. Motto's smile became a national symbol, not of poverty, but of potential. In the U.S., Obama sat with his advisors watching Traoré's speech again. He leaned forward. He's not just talking to us. He's rewriting the script. On Instagram, Beyoncé reposted Mamadou's drawing, captioned, From the soil rises the soul. Hashtag Burkina Strong began trending. Across 42 countries. In Brazil, students organized a march in support. In Germany, African tech founders launched a fund called Code Sankofa. Zuckerberg made no official comment, but Facebook's Africa division quietly reached out to local engineers. For Dialogue, Traoré had not just protested, he redirected the lens, and for the first time in decades, The world was finally looking not at Africa's pain, but its plans. Weeks later, Traoré stood once again before the people. This time not in a press hall, but in the open plains, an outdoor forum with over 50,000 youth gathered. Flags waved, drums rolled, eyes locked on their leader. He took the mic, no teleprompter, just heart. There was a time, he began, when our names were written by others, when our stories were posted without our permission. He paused, but no more. This, what we build together, is not a protest, it is a blueprint. The crowd roared. When I stood before the world, I did not ask to be liked, I demanded to be heard. He raised his hand, palm to the sky, and I say this to the world: you do not define Africa, you reflect her. Silence. Then thunder. He looked straight into the cameras, as if speaking to Obama, to Zuckerberg, to every child watching. You are living proof, he said, that we are building something bigger than ourselves. A hush fell over the crowd, then a slow rhythm began, one drum, then another, then thousands of hands clapping in unison. It wasn't celebration, it was confirmation. From every corner of Burkina Faso, from Senegal to South Africa, from Harlem to Haiti, a chant began to rise: Sankofa, Sankofa, Sankofa. And in that moment, the man once called dangerous became something far more powerful, a mirror not just of struggle, but of strategy, not just of pain, but of purpose. That night in the private quarters of the palace, Marie brought Traoré a sealed envelope, no markings, no return address inside. A handwritten letter. The signature at the bottom read, Edward Snowden. The message was brief: you did what most only dream of. You didn't just fight the system, you made it look in the mirror. Protect your network, protect your people, never let their silence be louder than your voice. Traoré placed the letter in his drawer, beside a worn-out notebook, one he used as a cadet, and on its first page, scribbled in pencil, were the words, "One day the empire will scroll us and we will not blink." Weeks passed, then months, and still no word from Zuckerberg, but the silence was telling. Meta's Africa growth plan was quietly shelved, their new AI model delayed, their local partnerships dissolved, because for the first time Africa wasn't just data, it was direction. One morning, while visiting a school in Bobo Dioulasso, Traoré was greeted by a 12-year-old girl named Ajesh. Didn't shake his hand, she saluted. "Sir," she said, "I coded my first app." "What does it do?" he asked. "It blocks hate speech and plays Sankofa music instead." Traoré laughed, a full, deep laugh. But his eyes watered, because this wasn't revolution anymore, it was revelation. Later that year at the African Union Summit, the agenda had only one item: digital sovereignty and the future of continental governance. Traoré didn't speak until the end. When he did, the hall went quiet. Empires were built on our silence, he said, but now our signal is stronger than theirs. In Silicon Valley, executives began calling it the Traoré effect, a warning, a shift, a continent no longer waiting to be discovered, but deciding what it will upload and what it will delete. That same week, a statue was unveiled in Ouagadougou, but it wasn't of Traoré. It was a circle carved from reclaimed tech waste, wired with solar lights and engraved with the names of children who had built their own devices from scraps. At the top, one phrase was written in 7 languages. They tried to code us, we wrote ourselves. And far from the headlines, far from the algorithms, a quiet evening returned to Ouagadougou. No protests, no hashtags, no press, just Ibrahim Traoré sitting beneath the baobab. Once again he opened his old notebook, took a pen, and wrote 4 simple words: the silence is ours. The dust in the plains had barely settled from the echoes of that speech, but its tremors, they were just beginning. Somewhere in Nairobi, a group of teenage girls, coders, barefoot and brilliant, huddled in a solar-powered community center. They had watched Traoré's speech on a borrowed laptop, pixelated, delayed, but powerful, and when he said, "You do not define Africa, you reflect her," one of them, Zuvana, stood up and whispered greater than, "Then let's show them her reflection." Within days their app Malcanet, went live a platform built by Girls for Girls connecting villages across East Africa. No filters, no ads, just stories told in Swahili. Yoruba Masi and Lingolate wasn't just code, it was resistance, it was ownership. Meanwhile in Paris, an unexpected letter landed on the desk of a certain French diplomat embossed with the seal of Burkina Faso inside, just 10 words greater than the age of paternalism. Is over, kindly update your files, Office of the President, Burkina Faso. It wasn't a threat, it was a reminder. The continent that had once been divided by borders drawn in foreign ink was now connecting itself through signal satellites and purpose, but not everyone celebrated. In the heart of Silicon Valley, boardrooms buzzed in uncomfortable silence. Slide decks flashed, data graphs showed drop-offs in daily usage across several African regions. A senior Meta executive spoke into the room. Greater than, we're not losing users, we're losing narrative control. Zuckerberg remained silent across the table. Someone hesitated, then asked, greater than, do we try to counter this with a campaign? Another voice, quieter but sharper, replied, no hashtag can compete. With dignity, they all knew it. The platform they once shaped was now being shaped by the unheard back in Burkina Faso. Traoré was in motion again, but not as a president, as a listener. He walked through the market streets of Bobo Dioulasso. No guards, no entourage, just him and a local radio reporter. A woman selling millet spotted him. Startled, he smiled. Greater than, don't worry, he said. I came to ask you something. She blinked, then asked, greater than, what does a president need from a millet vendor? He leaned in. Greater than, advice. The clip went viral across Africa. A president asking the people what they want, not just promising what they'll get. It shattered old scripts and rebuilt something stronger. Trust. Months passed, but the movement didn't slow it. Multiplied. Universities launched Sankofa fellowships. Diaspora communities sent back not just money, but engineers. Former migrants returned with new skills, choosing code over exile. Pan-African cybersecurity hub opened in Ouagadougou. Its name greater than Firewall. Sankara in South Africa, a poet named Luthando took the stage at the Pan-African Arts Festival. He wore no shoes, just beads and a torn shirt, but when he opened his mouth, the world stood still. Greater than, the internet was built to connect. US, he roared, but they used it to correct us. Now we code in our tongues. Now we post without permission. Now we stream our spirits, unbuffered. Now we are logged into ourselves, crowds erupted. A standing ovation in 20 dialects, and then a surprise announcement came from Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, and Mali. A joint venture with Burkina Faso. Greater than, Afrinet, the first fully independent African cloud. No Western servers, no backdoors, no data siphoning, just sovereignty in the form of software. The logo, a clenched fist holding a fiber optic cable. Reporters asked Traoré what he thought of the global reaction. He smiled gently and said, greater than, I don't want to break the internet, I want to free it. Back in the White House, a new U.S. president watched Traoré's latest speech. She turned to her tech advisors. We can't outpost him, she said, so we better listen to him. And so across a billion screens and a billion more hearts, the story of Ibrahim Traoré continued, not as a rebel, not as a radical, but as something far more unstoppable. A man who never asked permission because his people had already given him their blessing, and in a world of scrolls, streams, and silence, he became the only leader who could still do something no algorithm could predict. Make Africa heard. Final part, the closing of the Legend African Griot-style finale. Ibrahim Traoré, the man who refused to bow. The final chapter didn't come with war, it came with silence, a silence so loud it forced the world to stop scrolling. Ibrahim Traoré, now older, gray at the temples, walked alone to the edge of the Sahara. No cameras, no crowd, just wind, dust, and destiny. He looked over the dunes and whispered, this land raised me, but it is the people who made me. Behind him the continent had changed, not perfectly, but permanently. Villages once starved of light now pulsed with solar grids. Children once taught in colonial tongues now coded in Wolof, Igbo, and Mori elections, were decided not by bribes, but blockchainin. In every city mural walls painted with his face not as a ruler, but as a signal. The African Union, once a symbol of bureaucracy, had become the strongest digital coalition on the planet. When the IMF offered new partnerships, they were politely declined with receipts. When tech giants came bearing free internet, they were asked greater than free for whom. And when the world finally called Africa the future, the response was simple: greater than we are the present. In a final unannounced address, live-streamed across all of Afrinet, Traoré stood under a baobab tree, no flags, no stage, just his voice clear, measured, and final: greater than. My time has passed, but your time is just beginning. Greater than you were never poor, you were plundered. Greater than you were never broken, you were betrayed. Greater than. And now you rise, not because of me, but because you remembered you don't need permission to be free. Then he paused. Tears welled in the eyes of farmers, coders, artists, students, across 54 nations. A stillness, and then he said, greater than. Africa is not waiting anymore. She is walking forward, and if the world cannot keep up, she will walk alone. That night there were no fireworks, no parades, only a message that blinked across millions of African devices. Greater than. Thank you, Captain, we'll take it from here. And with that, Ibrahim Traoré disappeared into the pages of history, not as a king, not as a god, but as something the world could no longer deny, a son of the soil, who stood so that his people could run.